All right, wrapping up chapter 27, finishing up with the acid-base balance. So before we get into the acid and base balance, just finishing up our different ions. So in the last one, we talked about calcium, potassium, we talked about sodium. So now continuing on learning a little bit more about phosphate. So first of all, what does it do for us? Multiple things. So first of all, it's tied to the calcium in our bones to help calcify and harden bones, but also it forms phospholipids that make up those cell membranes that control what's coming in and out of the cell. Our genetic information, DNA and RNA, have a sugar phosphate backbone, so phosphates are used to make up those nucleotides. And then finally, our energy stores, so ATP, that P is a phosphate group. So adding and removing that adds or removes energy from that molecule. It's also involved in regulating enzyme activity, so phosphorylation adds phosphates to enzymes that changes their shape, which can ultimately change their function, either turning them on or off. And then they're also involved in buffers. So again, we'll come back to this with acids and bases in a little bit. And the most common form is hydrogen phosphate. All right, so reabsorption in the kidney of phosphate ions is actually pretty limited. So instead, just like with calcium, parathyroid is going to raise phosphate levels through bone reabsorption. So just like with calcium, if those phosphate levels drop, we release the phosphate from bone. If there's excess phosphate, though, it's either excreted, so it's removed in the urine, or it precipitates into the calcium phosphate as salts in our soft tissues. So our conditions hypophosphatemia is that low phosphate. This is due to kind of reduced absorption through the intestines, again linked to vitamin D, just like with calcium. Mainly see this in alcohol abuse as well. And then hyperphosphatemia, so too much phosphate. This is due to renal failure because, again, that excess is excreted in the urine. So if the kidneys aren't working, that phosphate builds up. We also see it in chemotherapy, hyperparathyroidism, so again, too much PTH, which is kind of secondary to the elevated calcium levels, which are a bigger problem. Looking at magnesium, so its job, so most of it gets stored in bones as well. So we have calcium, we have phosphate, and we have magnesium stored in the bones, but also the ICF, which is the intracellular fluid, so inside of the cell. Less than 1% is outside. So again, last time we talked about the majority of water is stored or found inside of our cells, which is where that magnesium would be found. It's involved in intracellular enzymes, so it's cofactors. A cofactor is a non-protein part that helps the enzyme do its job. And it's particularly important for that sodium-potassium pump that is so important with our neurons communicating, as well as in the urinary system, to allow for proper solutes to be secreted or, absorbed. So then how it's regulated, so free magnesium flows easily through the filtration membranes of the kidney. Most of that is going to be reabsorbed through the filtrate back into the blood supply. So the control of reabsorption, though, is actually not clear, whether it's hormonal or different pressures or what the case may be, so a little less is known about it. So with our imbalances, so again, the main thing here with either high or low magnesium produces the main effects through that sodium-potassium pump, where it's a cofactor for that and is important in helping it work. So if we have low magnesium, then we get weakness and muscle convulsions, again, mainly due to that sodium-potassium pump not allowing the right electric current to move across those muscles. If we have too much, so the hyper magnesium, this leads to nausea and low blood pressure, as well as low respiratory rates. Now, if we look at the hormonal regulation of our body fluids, so those changes are directly proportional to blood pressure changes. So then 3 main hormones are involved in this system. So we talked about these Same ones with our urinary system. So we have renin, angiotensin, aldosterone. We also have the atrial natriuretic hormone and the antidiuretic hormone. So again, same things that we mentioned with the urinary system. So again, if we look at this with the blood pressure's effect on sodium and water reabsorption, again, the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, this increases blood pressure. So this gets activated whenever the blood pressure drops. Those juxtaglomerular cells detect the decrease in blood pressure in those afferent arterioles. They're going to release the renin. That converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1, which is then converted to angiotensin 2. And that raises the blood pressure because it causes vasoconstriction. It also stimulates thirst, as we'd mentioned earlier in this chapter, and it releases aldosterone. So again, this is the same slide that we talked about in the urinary system. So this is why we're kind of talking about these two chapters together. All right, so then if we look at the effect of blood pressure on the right atrium, so again, looking at sodium and water excretion. So what happens whenever we have an increased venous return to the right atrial? That's where that ANH gets released. That reduces sodium reabsorption in those convoluted tubules. That's going to increase the excretion of sodium, and then water goes with it. So this is going to be decreasing the fluid that is reabsorbed. So this is going to increase urine output. And this is due to a high blood pressure. So again, renin is released when the blood pressure is low. That is detected by those juxtaglomerular cells. In the atria, though, if the blood pressure gets high, ANH gets released, and we are going to, instead of reabsorbing water and sodium, they stop reabsorption to increase urine. So it's going to increase that urine output, which is going to then decrease the blood pressure. Now, if we look at the effect of blood osmolality, so thinking more about solute concentration and blood pressure. So what happens with low blood pressure, so similar to the renin, this stimulates antidiuretic hormone to be secreted that promotes reabsorption. And that's going to increase the blood volume and therefore the blood pressure. So here we're using osmoreceptors instead of looking for a change in blood pressure. These are going to be activated due to that increased osmotic pressure, changes again in how hypertonic or hypotonic the solutions are becoming. Again, baroreceptors, those are the ones that are going to be looking for the change in pressures. Again, just a nice little summary slide here looking at the homeostasis. So again, looking at osmolality. So if that increases, again, we're going to get activation of the control center using those osmoreceptors. That's going to cause water reabsorption at the distal tubules, and then that's going to kind of dilute out that hypertonic situation that's happening outside of our cells. So then the blood osmolality returns to normal. Now, if the opposite occurs, so if the osmolality decreases and now our blood is kind of too diluted, then again, those osmoreceptors get activated in the hypothalamus, and that's going to create an effect that decreases that antidiuretic hormone. So the absence of diuretic hormone is going to cause then less water or more water to be excreted, and that will return the urine output to normal. All right, now shifting now to this acid-base balance, because this is another job of the urinary system. So this is all regulating the hydrogen ion concentration, which is what our pH is based on, is the amount of hydrogen ions. Now, the reason this is important is because that concentration of hydrogen ions affects enzymes, and enzymes essentially control everything, all parts of our metabolism. But it also, also is part of those, it is an ion, so it's positively charged, so it can interact with other ions as well that can disrupt other systems. So again, most reactions are sensitive to changes in pH, mainly because of that hydrogen ion concentration. So pH is a measure of the concentration. It is an inverse relationship, meaning a low pH, so like 0, that's the most acidic, meaning the highest amounts of hydrogen ions, whereas a pH of 14, which is the range, 0 to 14, this is the least acidic, least amount of hydrogen ions. We also say it's the most basic, which is the amount of hydroxide, OH ions. So acids, by definition, release hydrogen ions into solution. So they are going to be increasing that hydrogen ion concentration and decreasing the pH. Now we have strong acids. Those completely dissociate. So like hydrochloric acid, HCl, and water, all the hydrogens come off, all the chloride ions come off. So it really changes the pH. Whereas weak acids, they release hydrogen but do not completely dissociate. So they're not going to cause as big of change to the pH. And then the opposite are bases. These are removing hydrogen ions or adding hydroxide, which then combines with the hydrogen ions to make water. So both of these are decreasing the amount of hydrogen ions, which increases pH. Same idea here, strong bases are going to completely dissociate, so they have major impacts on the pH, so like sodium hydroxide. In water, the sodium ions come off, the hydroxides, they completely remove from each other. So again, we cause major shifts in pH. Whereas weak bases, again, only partially or incompletely dissociate into their ions. And then we have buffers. So due to these changes, buffers are chemicals that prevent extreme changes. It doesn't mean the pH doesn't move a little bit, but it prevents extreme, like especially with those strong acids and bases. All right, so again, different types of acids and bases. So again, especially with strong acids, again, like hydrochloric acid, again, complete dissociation. So in water, all of the hydrochloric acid gets converted to hydrogen ions, so huge decrease in the pH. Strong bases, opposite effect, but complete dissociation. Now we have all this excess hydroxide. Hydrogen combines with that to make water, so it decreases the hydrogen ion concentration and raises pH. Whereas in a weak acid, you get this equilibrium to where some of it, like carbonic acid, some of it stays as carbonic acid, and some of it releases some of the hydrogen ions into bicarbonate. So it's just a partial dissociation. We're not completely breaking all of it down into the ionic form. So then how is this regulated? So there are some chemical buffers that work immediately, and then there are physiological buffers, especially in the respiratory system and in the renal system. So in the respiratory system, this is a short-term kind of rapid response through breathing. So we'll talk about carbonic acid with that. And then in the renal system, though, it's more long-term, which is a slower response. They can take hours or even days to regulate. So looking first at the carbonic acid bicarbonate system. So this again is a weak acid like we'd shown on the one of the previous slides. So this happens when carbon dioxide reacts with water. It forms carbonic acid. So CO2 plus H2O gives you carbonic acid. And then as we saw, it partially dissociates, meaning it doesn't completely break down to bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. So it's increasing hydrogen ion concentration that decreases the pH. Now, if there's excess hydrogen ion, so again, if we're in an acidic situation, so say we've had an increase in hydrogen ions, then that bicarbonate can combine with them to form carbonic acid, which is going to decrease the pH. Right? So if we get rid of some of this here. So again, what's going to happen if there is excess hydrogen ions, then our reaction is going to go this way. So it's going to go to the left. All the extra hydrogen ions combine with bicarbonate, and that's going to give us carbonic acid. Now, if the opposite happens, so now if we have, get rid of those, now if we have an excess base and we have hydroxides being added, now we need to increase hydrogen ions. So now we're going to go to the right. Now carbonic acid is going to break down and release hydrogen ions. That'll put the hydrogen ion concentration back to normal by releasing those hydrogen ions. So again, this reaction can go in either direction depending on whether we need to release hydrogen or absorb the hydrogen. So this system is really important at looking at extracellular pH, so hydrogen ion concentration outside of the cells. So it responds quickly to adding carbon dioxide. So if we're holding our breath, for example, that carbon dioxide builds up in our lungs. The extra carbon dioxide makes more carbonic acid that releases more hydrogen ions, and our pH breaks or pH lowers. Same thing with lactate. So whenever we're exercising and we switch from aerobic to anaerobic respiration, whenever we don't have enough oxygen in our muscles, now that lactate, so we go through glycolysis to make glucose, and now we're switching, instead of going through the Krebs cycle and electron transport, now we're doing fermentation, and we get the buildup of this lactate, which is an acid, so lactic acid. So now that is going to decrease our pH. Also increased fatty acids and ketone body production, which occur especially in diabetes whenever the glucose isn't being broken down, because again, cells can't absorb glucose with diabetes, so they're breaking down fats and breaking down proteins, and that increases fatty acids and ketone bodies from the breakdown of those proteins whenever glucose can't be used for energy. So in addition to large amounts of just basic substances like antacids, so if we add those to those, so again, somebody's taking too many antacids, now we have or pH is too high. So again, the bicarbonate system here can respond to that quickly. So these are essential part, again, of both our physiological buffer systems. Now, the protein buffer system, this is mainly for our intracellular pH. So this is using intracellular proteins as well as plasma proteins. So for example, hemoglobin in our red blood cells that's transporting our oxygen, it's actually a protein buffer. It can help regulate pH. So they can function as buffers because amino acids have a carboxyl group, which is an acid. It can donate this hydrogen ion. And they have an amino group, which is a base, because hydrogen ions can join onto that nitrogen to make ammonia. So those amino acid groups can act as weak acids and bases and alter and regulate that hydrogen ion concentration. Now our chemical, again, another chemical buffer here is the phosphate buffer system. Again, most important here for our intracellular buffer system, so regulating everything inside. So this is using phosphate, as the name implies. So those molecules like DNA and RNA, as well as ATP, which is why we need those phosphorus ions, those are going to act as buffers, because what's going to happen is if there's excess hydrogen ions, it combines to create phosphoric acid. So we add the hydrogen to the hydrogen phosphate to make phosphoric acid. Also, excess hydroxide ions can also then go in the opposite direction, so that phosphoric acid can then absorb those to create hydrogen phosphate. Then our physiological buffer systems, this is going to regulate regulation here in the respiratory system. So again, this is, again, that carbonic acid that we talked about. So it is both a chemical and a physiological buffer system. But again, water combines with carbon dioxide, makes carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is a weak acid that gives up some hydrogen ions to form bicarbonate. So as carbon dioxide levels increase, the pH is going to decrease because everything is moving toward the right. We have more carbon dioxide, more carbonic acid equals more hydrogen. However, if we have the opposite, so if our carbon dioxide levels decrease, now everything, get rid of that, now everything is going to go to the left. So as that releases, now the hydrogen ions can combine with bicarbonate. That's going to form the carbonic acid, and then that can then be broken down to release carbon dioxide in water. All right, so again, using this by pH, the carbon dioxide levels and pH affect our respiratory centers. So hypoventilation means that we're not breathing as well. So this is, so essentially holding your breath, that increases carbon dioxide levels, and it's going to push that reaction to the right. We're going to get more hydrogen ions being released and our pH drops. Hyperventilation has the opposite effect. This is going to decrease the carbon dioxide level, so we're going to shift everything, that reaction we just had seen, to the left. All right, so just kind of visualizing all of this. So first of all, there's an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase that's going to catalyze the formation of carbonic acid by combining carbon dioxide and water. So this is found in pretty high concentrations in red blood cells and also at the surface of our capillaries of those epithelial cells. So it does not influence equilibrium, it just speeds up the reaction. So it doesn't make it a strong acid, it just helps it to get there faster. So what happens are chemoreceptors detect a decrease in the pH, which means we have too much hydrogen ions. So what's going to happen is the neurons are going to increase that respiratory center in the brainstem to increase our rate. So now we're going to get more deep breathing. This eliminates that carbon dioxide as we exhale through those deep breaths. So the removal of carbon dioxide then decreases how much carbonic acid we have. Bicarbonate is combining with the excess hydrogen, and that lowers the levels of pH, and our pH becomes more basic. So again, that's with hypoventilation, or decreasing our respiration rate. All right, now if we look at regulation by the urinary system instead of the respiratory system, secretion of hydrogen ions in the filtrate. So remember, we have reabsorption, but after we move through the nephron, we also at the end get secretion of some of our molecules, and that includes hydrogen ions, as well as reabsorption of bicarbonate into that extracellular fluid. Both of those could cause pH levels to go up. So the bicarbonate in that filtrate gets reabsorbed. Again, it's returned to the extracellular fluid by that sodium bicarbonate symport. So sodium and bicarbonate are coming in, they're being transported together. Sodium's going with its concentration to fuel the movement and transport of bicarbonate. So the rate of hydrogen ion secretion increases. So we're looking here at an increase as the pH decreases. So if our pH is low, that means we have too much hydrogen ions in our circulation. So that's going to trigger the urinary system to get rid of those hydrogen ions. Also, aldosterone levels increasing will have that same effect. So secretion of hydrogen is inhibited when the urine falls below 4.5. So that's going to stop that secretion. So buffers that are in the filtrate combined with the hydrogen ions, these include the bicarbonate buffer, also phosphate ions, and ammonia, which comes from that urea, or that's similar to urea, where we're getting the nitrogen and hydrogen combining to make urea or ammonia. So that's absorbing those hydrogen ions. All right, so if we visualize what's happening here in the kidneys, so again, carbonic anhydrase is going to cause the formation of carbonic acid that then dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. So an antiporter, just meaning they're moving in opposite directions here, this exchanges the hydrogen ions for sodium across that. So now the tubules secrete hydrogen ions as they reabsorb that sodium. And then sodium and bicarbonate are symported, so they're moved together across that basal membrane. So then after sodium and bicarbonate are symported from the tubules, meaning again going together, they can diffuse into those paratubular capillaries, and then the hydrogen ions are secreted and bicarbonate passes into the extracellular space. So the reason that buffers are so important and that we spend some time talking about it is because pH is extremely important for normal body function. So the normal body pH only shifts by a little bit. So 7.35 to 7.45. It's considered acidosis after the pH falls below. So remember, lower pH is more acidic, higher is more basic. So acidosis is the term for a pH less than 7.35. Alkalosis, which is alkyne or basic, has a pH above 7.45. So again, buffers are extremely important to keep that pH normal within that very small window to where everything is functioning normally. Otherwise, our proteins start becoming denatured and things start really falling apart. So respiratory acidosis and alkalosis have a respiratory cause, so they're going to, of course, affect the respiratory system. And then we have metabolic acidosis and alkalosis that are caused from metabolic causes. So again, thinking about respiratory causes, this would be from ventilation, so hyperventilating or hypoventilating, controlling those carbon dioxide levels. Those would be respiratory causes. Metabolic causes would be things like diabetes, where you're not breaking down or using glucose, so then your body switches to proteins and fatty acids, so that's changing the pH as well. So looking at acidosis, again, this is usually caused from depressing the central nervous system. So individuals become disoriented, can even progress to a coma. So that respiratory acidosis, again, this is from inadequate ventilation. So again, hyperventilation. So we have too much carbon dioxide building up that causes that carbonic acid and lowers the pH. So again, buffers helps to reduce that over a short time. And again, kidneys help increase hydrogen ion excretion and increase reabsorption of bicarbonate over a long period to offset that. Then metabolic acidosis, this is from any condition that lowers pH in the fluids except respiratory. So again, diabetes is the main one. So buffers are the first line defense. Then the respiratory system responds again by hyperventilation to eliminate the extra carbon dioxide. Then the kidneys for that long term, again, secreting the excess hydrogen ions, increasing bicarbonate reabsorption. Then alkalosis, this is mainly from hyperexcitability of the nervous system. So those peripheral nerves react with spasm, contractions, convulsions that ultimately can lead to death by the respiratory muscles not working. So respiratory alkalosis is from hyperventilating, again, getting rid of too much carbon dioxide. So again, that decreases the amount of hydrogen ions, which increases our pH. So then this can occur from being at high altitudes for long periods of time. So again, not getting enough oxygen in, or in this case, enough carbon dioxide out. So then the kidneys respond by decreasing hydrogen ion secretion and decreasing reabsorption of bicarbonates. So again, metabolic alkalosis, this is from any body condition other than respiration where we're increasing that pH above that 7.45. So like excess antacids or severe vomiting due to illness, or especially in cases of eating disorders. So these buffers, again, first response as is with acidosis, to react with those excess bases. Then the respiratory will decrease respiration, so again, hypoventilating, which allows the carbon dioxide to accumulate. And then finally, the kidneys will respond by reducing the rates. Responding again by reducing the rate of secretion, so holding on to those hydrogen ions. All right, and then just a nice little summary slide here with what we just talked about as far as what happens whenever the pH gets too low. So again, those hydrogen ions decrease. The body responds. Again, first line defenses are always the buffers, then the respiratory changing hypoventilation or hyperventilation, and then finally the kidneys over long-term responding by changing hydrogen ion secretion and bicarbonates reabsorption. So again, nice little summary figure to go back through those.